Data Tech have had the great pleasure of witnessing this lady's career excel over the years. And I'm delighted to introduce Celia Wilson, the Director of Data Business Partnering for The Guardian. Celia is going to share a really personal story with us all, and it's about her confidence journey in data specifically. Please help me welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Roisin, and thank you, Data Tech, for organising this fantastic conference. My name is Celia Wilson. I'm Director of Data Business Partnering at Guardian News and Media. But I want to share with you my first title. And by title, I mean nickname. This was the nickname I was given when I started school. Miss Mouse. I started school at 4. I was the youngest and smallest in my year, but I was also incredibly quiet and incredibly shy. This was the name the teachers gave me, not the other pupils. So that gives you an idea of how quiet and shy I was. But now my title is essentially Director of Talking to People about Data. So I've come quite a long way. And what I wanted to share with you today were some of the books, the techniques, and most importantly, the people that have inspired me along the way. Most of those people are women, but not all of them are, and none of them are directly connected to the data industry. They're not data professionals. So why have I chosen to talk about this topic? Well, I think it's something particularly pertinent for the data industry. Data people are not, and I can say this because I am one, we're not renowned for being the most outgoing people. If you're like me, you'd probably be in front of a load of numbers rather than being in front of a load of people. And I think especially women, to Pyle's point earlier, we can hold ourselves back, especially if we're in a room full of men, which often happens. But what we do really requires confidence, that confidence to speak up and to speak out. We need to tell those stories, we need to challenge those accepted truths, and we need to persuade people. And I think compared to some other industries, we actually get exposed to senior management from quite a junior level. You're up in front of senior management, essentially trying to persuade them to make their decisions based on data, and you need a lot of confidence to do that. So I've grouped the things that I've learned into 4 categories. They are know yourself, win friends, sit at the table, and play to your strengths. And each one of these represents a different lesson that I've learned at different points in my career. And each one has a different poster girl or poster boy representing that lesson, because they have been the most inspirational person for me. So first of all, know yourself. And on that note, a little bit about me, my background. So at school, my favourite subject was maths. Probably not a great surprise, and I think it's probably true of most of you in this room. I loved all of the kind of analytical subjects, and in sixth form I loved economics. And that prompted me to study economics and management at university. And at university I was expecting the more analytical subjects like econometrics to be my favourite, but actually I really fell in love with marketing, the creative side. And after university I wanted to do something that really combined maths with marketing. Didn't really know those types of jobs existed, but I went and looked, and I came across a role at a company called the Henley Centre, which was a futures company, a futures consultancy, now called the Futures Company, part of WPP. And I got a role as a quantitative analyst, which I loved. I could spend all day making drivers models, drivers of customer satisfaction, doing market mix modelling, and market forecasting. I loved all of that behind the scenes stuff. I kind of avoided the other stuff. I thought, I don't really want to talk to clients. I don't really want to go out and present. That's not really me. That's a bit scary, but it's fine. If I just sit here and do my models, possibly no one will notice and I can get away with it. And they did notice and I didn't get away with it. And after about a year, I was almost kind of forcibly shoved into my first presentation. And I'll never forget it. It was a charity presentation for Riding for the Disabled Association in front of about 40 people. And it was really, really shocking because I loved it. I thought, this is great. And based on the feedback, I also wasn't as bad at it as I thought I would be. So that sort of got me thinking that, okay, maybe just because I have a preference for those more kind of introspective, observational activities, it doesn't mean I don't have the ability to go out and talk to people. So that got me learning more about personality types, and that brings me on to my first poster girls. If you know who they are, I'll be really, really impressed. Do you know? Wow, okay. So for those of you who don't, this is Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers, which probably gives you a clue. So this is a mother and daughter pair, and between roughly 1917 and 1943, they created this, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which was one of the first and most well-known personality profiling tools. And they're inspirational themselves because they were completely self-taught, they had no formal training in psychology, and they were dominating in a field which, like all the fields, was pretty much run by men. And what they were really driven by was an interest in people and an interest in the differences between people. And they were non-judgmental, and this is the point. There are no good and bad personalities. And I've just chosen this quote from them because I like it. The best adjusted people are the psychologically patriotic, I think that's a great expression, who are glad to be what they are. So the point is, whatever personality type you are, work with it, don't be ashamed. I could talk about Myers-Briggs all day because I think it's really fascinating, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to talk about the introvert-extrovert dimension. So they know in the US, where Myers-Briggs is from, that about 30 to 50% of the population are introverts. I couldn't find any stats for the UK, but given that I think the UK is quite a lot more introverted than the US, safe to say it's over 50%. And I definitely couldn't find any stats for British women working in the data industry. That was a bit too niche. So I thought I'd do a live piece of research, if you're all right with that. So everyone stand up. Okay, everyone up? Right, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So, first question, do you immediately feel self-conscious and a bit silly and are standing there thinking, I really wish she hadn't asked me to stand up? If you think that, sit down. Be honest, we're among friends. Okay, I don't believe most of you, but all right. Okay, second question. Imagine you've spent all day at a workshop. Not this sort of workshop where you're kind of mostly listening, but the type of workshop where you're interacting, talking to people, having to feedback, having to present all day. It gets to 5 o'clock. What do you want to do? Do you think, I want to go home, I want to read a book? Or do you think, yay, networking drinks? If you thought, read a book, sit down. Okay, good. Okay, final question. Do you tend to think before you speak, or do you tend to kind of think on your feet, kind of think as you're speaking? If you say, think before you speak, sit down. Okay, Regine's still standing, so I know this is accurate. Okay, so the people still standing, you are my extroverts, and I'm relying on you to kind of whoop and cheer at the end. Introverts, you are my people, I understand you. And I just want to say, don't worry, I'm not going to make you do anything else for the rest of the day. So you're okay, and you can sit down now. Thank you. So that was a good piece of research. I like that. What do we end up with? About a quarter?
21.
20? Oh, good counting. Okay, so what percentage is that?
You'll be cheap later at the bar.
Exactly. Everyone will just go home. It'll be fine. So partly I was doing that because I wanted to make a point. Introversion is not about being completely socially inept. It's not about not being able to talk to people. It's purely about where you draw your energy from, and introverts draw their energy from introspection, from time by themselves, and from observation. And spending time with others, they enjoy and they can do it, but it tends to drain them, or should I say us. So reading more about that and kind of understanding more about my personality type helped give me confidence. It helped me realise that, okay, not just because I'm not necessarily speaking as much in a given situation doesn't mean that I'm not as knowledgeable as the other people around me. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be interested in what I have to say. And that gave me more confidence to speak out. And it helped me in a couple of situations. So after the Henley Centre, I went to a charity for a bit, but then I went to Royal Mail as a segmentation and analysis manager. And I had to work with the marketing teams, and I also had to work with the sales teams. And salespeople are probably diametrically opposed to me on Myers-Briggs on every dimension. So, we could have just been talking different languages to each other. And I had to go to them and try and persuade them to have a different segmentation. And the first few times I did it, they did just look at me like I was an alien. But by understanding more about my personality type and their personality type, I learned to speak their language a little bit more. I learned to kind of act a little bit more outgoing, get to the point a lot quicker. And it must have worked, because eventually they hired me and I went over to Royal Mail Sales to become the data point person for SMEs. So knowing your personality type is a good start. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve everything. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of syndromes that data people can occasionally suffer from. The first one is this. Do you ever feel like an imposter? Do you ever feel like a cat pretending to be a rabbit? This presentation is full of animals, by the way. I don't know. Cats, rabbits, mice, jellyfish. Has anyone ever felt like that? A lot of women I know have, and they've said this to me, and I have on many occasions. And it's sort of that feeling that everyone else around me knows exactly what they're talking about. I've managed to fool everyone so far, but any day now I'm going to be found out. And the key to feeling like this is you think it's just you, and it's really not just you. It's actually incredibly common. They've done some research that shows that about 70% of people feel like this at some point in their lives, and that's highly skewed towards women. So I'm going to be quite bold and say 100% of women feel like that at some point, and probably only 40% of men, because the men I know never seem to say that. So how can you deal with this? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But partly, there's an element of just telling that voice in your head to shut up and ignore it, and to say, no, it's not just me who feels like this. Everyone around the table feels like this. Therefore, my opinion is just as valid as everyone else's, and you kind of just have to talk through it. But there is also evidence to show that feeling a bit like an imposter sometimes is not necessarily a bad thing. And I'm going to talk about the alternative. What if you're a bit overconfident? What can that look like? I call this saviour syndrome. Or there's another name for it, which is smartest guy in the room syndrome, which is not meaning to be sexist, but it's generally men who are like this. And it's sort of that attitude, which is, I have the data and I have a degree in maths, therefore I am God, and you will listen to me, and your opinion is wrong. To be fair, I have seen both men and women do this. Does tend to be more often men. But I'll just give an example of a fairly junior analyst in my team who had just joined, who, I'm smiling because the person in my team knows exactly what I'm talking about, but she's not going to say, walked into a room full of fairly senior people who he barely met, and basically told them that everything they'd done up to that point was wrong, but it was fine because he was going to come and sort them out. And whilst you've got to admire that sort of confidence, it kind of has the opposite to the intended effect, because they all just went, sod off. Like, we don't want your advice. Yes, you might know the data, but we know our stuff, and it backfired. It just got their backs up. So how do you strike that balance between being underconfident and overconfident? And that brings me to my next section, winning friends. So back to me for a second. Royal Mail was great, but I started looking for something a little bit more digital, a little bit more forward-looking, and I went to probably the other end of the spectrum, which was Skype. And Skype at the time was a fairly new organisation. I think it was only about 6 years old. And it was quite big in terms of number of people, but it very much had the feel of a startup. It's very disorganised. It had a lot of data, but didn't know what to do with it at all. And I think for the whole company of several hundred people, there were 2 customer analysts and 1 digital analyst, which is sort of unthinkable now. But we were tasked with just kind of going out into the business and embedding this data and trying to get people to stop making decisions purely on gut feel and make them based on the data. And it was tempting to be that smartest guy in the room and just kind of think, all right, I just have to be loud and right and everyone will listen to me. But we've seen that doesn't work. It gets people's backs up. But while I was at Skype, I discovered this guy. It's my one and only poster boy. And just in case you don't know who this is a guy called Dale Carnegie. He started off as a salesman, then he was a lecturer in public speaking, but he's probably most famous for writing this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. This was published in 1936. It was probably one of the first ever self-help books, and it sold about 30 million copies since then. I can genuinely say this book changed my life. Can't say that about many books. I reread it every couple of years, and it's always fresh, and it's always relevant, and it's always useful. There is an updated version which sort of tells you how to win friends and influence people over social media. I read the 1936 version, which has lots of references to obscure American presidents that I've never heard of. It is still incredibly relevant. If you haven't read it, it could seem a little bit manipulative, a little bit salesy, talking about influencing people. You're like, oh no, I'm not a salesperson. But it's not. And explicitly, he talks about being genuine. To Georgina's point, if you're not genuine in your interactions with people, they will see straight through you anyway. You have to have that real interest in people. So it's full of good advice. His first piece of advice is never criticise, complain, or condemn. And that in itself is incredibly useful. There are other ones as well. Give honest and sincere appreciation, which is especially useful when you start managing people. And the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. So they sound simple, but they're actually quite easy to follow. I mean, who in here could say that they've never got into an argument, ever? But that is the advice. And if you follow it, it genuinely works. So how did that work for me at Skype? Well, I had to make friends with some fairly senior people from a fairly junior level. One of the first things I had to do was make an Exco dashboard for the CEO. They didn't have any reporting at all, really. So first of all, I had to make friends with the CEO, who was a fairly terrifying man. But also, I had to get buy-in from all of the various stakeholders. They all wanted metrics in there that sort of represented their agenda, rather than were the best ones for them to make decisions. But only, some recognition over there, only by talking to them all individually and kind of working through that could we create something. In the end, we created something that everyone agreed with, which was quite an achievement. So, a little bit of an interlude from my 4 sections. After 2 years at Skype, I took a 12-month break because this happened. This is my first daughter. So I was off for 12 months and then kind of thinking about what to do when I was coming back. And I had the option of going back to Skype. But while I had been busy raising that, my husband had been busy setting up his own analytics agency called S&G. So after my 12 months, I had the choice in front of me. Should I go back to what I know, or should I take the plunge and do something different? And that's what I did. I joined Stubborn Glasses, I think, as employee number 4 or something like that. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn a new part of analytics. It was digital analytics rather than customer, which is what I was used to. It was great because I got to do part-time, which can make things easier when you're a working mum. It did have the downside, though, that my husband was my boss, but you can't have everything. But it was an incredibly exciting time. We built the company up from 4 to 15 people. We got some really big clients on board. Skype, my old employer, Last Minute, Betfair, Sky. It was a great time. So I was there for 2 years, and then after 2 years, I had another break, because this happened. And just to note kind of about being a working mum. Being a working mum, or just generally being a mum, that's a whole another area where you can lose confidence. Possibly more so than data. You know, children don't behave like SPSS behaves, unfortunately. So I'd advise if you are a mum, or if you're thinking of being one at some point in the future, watch Claire Thompson's presentation from last year's Women in Data, because she gave a brilliant presentation about just this. And the bit that resonated with me is how much you have to let go of being a perfectionist. And I think that's something really hard for analysts. We are perfectionists by nature. She talks about the sort of mind-numbing fear of sending her girls to school when her husband has done their hair. And I get that. Like my eldest daughter is at school right now with daddy hair, and it's awful. But you have to get beyond that, because you can't be Superwoman. You can't do everything. So after my second, I was thinking about what to do next, and S&G was no more. Everyone had gone off to do their own things. But I found a role going at a brand that I felt very passionate about, which is The Guardian. And I got the role as head of customer data analysis, so it was kind of going back to my bread and butter, if you like. And I had the opportunity to kind of build that team, set up a fantastic team. And around that time, I discovered the writings of another woman who is anti-perfectionist, who talks a lot about being a working mum, says a lot of the same things. And this is one of her catchphrases: sit at the table. Does anyone know who this might be? Some people? Very good. Everyone know who this is? Okay. Yeah, this is Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, and possibly most famous for writing this book, Lean In. Quick show of hands, who's read Lean In? Okay, that's not nearly enough of you. I just, if I had one piece of advice, please read this book. It is fantastic. I should emphasize that it has faced some criticisms. Some people criticize it for talking about working within a system which is inherently stacked against women, rather than fighting that system from the outside. And some people say it doesn't fully appreciate the difficulties faced by non-white women, by single mothers, by lower income women. And I think some of those criticisms possibly right, but at the same time it's a little bit unfair to expect one book to solve the entire problem of gender inequality in one go. So I would still say read it. And she talks a lot about making the right decision for you at the right time. And that helped me in making a decision to go up in my hours. One thing she talks about is if women are going to lean in to their career, then they will be massively helped if their husbands and partners could do the reverse and lean in to their family life. And I was lucky in that my husband stepped up and agreed to do just that, and we equalised our working hours, and we both went to 9-day fortnights, so we have alternate Fridays off. And kudos to Tesco for being a sort of progressive employer there. I know it wouldn't be possible with lots of employers, but Sheryl encouraged us to do that. She has loads and loads of good advice. Done is better than perfect, coming back to the anti-perfectionism thing. There's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. Is another one, a bit strong, but fair. And this one, which I like. Women need to shift from thinking, I'm not ready to do that, to thinking, I want to do that and I'll learn by doing it. And I think this is the crux of it. This is the sitting at the table bit. And it reminded me, reading this, I was reminded of some really bad advice that I'd been given, as well as at Royal Mail actually, by my line manager at the time. And we had just come out of this big meeting with fairly senior people, and she commented on someone else, another junior, who had been in the meeting and hadn't said anything. And she said, that's really bad. You should never go to a meeting if you're not going to say anything. And I sort of took that at face value. I took it on board, and I think I've been subconsciously following that advice. I look back and think there are many times where I didn't go to a meeting because I thought, I don't know if I'll have anything to say. I don't know as much as the people in there. And having read this book, I thought, that's ridiculous. If you never go to those meetings and you don't sit at the table and you don't listen, you're never going to be able to say anything. So you really hold yourself back by doing that. But you have to have the confidence and you have to seize those opportunities. On the other side, it reminds me of a great piece of advice from Pyle in her keynote speech at last year's Women in Data, piece of advice which I've used on many occasions, which is talk like your boss, which has served me very well, so thank you, Pyle. But yeah, you have to go to those meetings, you have to ignore the imposter voice in your head, you have to ask questions, or do you know what, absorb, that's fine, or speak up. And this gave me the confidence to seize other opportunities and specifically to apply for a role. So after about a year at The Guardian, they decided to take the small, disparate data teams that were scattered across the business and merge them into one under the Chief Strategy Officer. And he opened up applications for an interim director across the whole team. And I knew that all of the other senior data people, data and insight people across the company were going for this. And initially I thought, oh, no, I'm not going to go for that because they're all more senior than me and I'll just make a fool of myself. And it took a combination of Cheryl, some of those colleagues, my line manager, my husband and my mum saying, for goodness sake, go for it. And after a while, I sort of got it and I thought, do you know what, I've got nothing to lose. At the very least, I'm getting my CV in front of the CSO of The Guardian and getting to chat to him about what the data team might look like. So what happened? Well, in the end, none of us got that job, and he decided not to hire an interim. He decided instead to split the team into two, make 2 permanent director roles, and I got one of those, which is my current role. Which brings me on to my final section, play to your strengths. So I'd just been promoted into a much bigger role. It was a big step for me. I'd gone from managing individual projects to managing whole teams, from setting individual tasks to setting entire direction, and from providing data and insight to one department at Guardian News Media to essentially the whole company. So it was big, and it could have been intimidating. And Cheryl, I like to call her Cheryl like I know her. I don't. Cheryl helped me a lot, but the trouble with Cheryl is she's really not like me. She is a raving extrovert, and she will talk in her book about, she'd be sitting in meetings and she's just like holding herself back and not speaking, and I thought, well, that's not like me. So I started looking around to see if there were any introvert role models out there. And what I found is that there were lots of male ones, especially in technology, so Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, most of them, to be honest. But they could kind of get away with it. They could just get away with being the tech geek and not being able to speak to anyone. And I think it's harder for women to be introvert and be at that top level. But I came across Marissa Mayer, who's the CEO of Yahoo, who's done incredibly well, despite saying that she is a massive introvert, probably even more than me, doesn't like going to parties, speaking to anyone, so she's done brilliantly. But while reading about Marissa Mayer, I discovered this woman. Her name is Susan Cain. She started her career as a lawyer, but then started developing an interest in psychology and then became a writer. And she wrote a book called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which is basically kind of bigging up introverts. And that's not the example I'm going to give here. The example I'm going to give here is this. This is her doing a TED Talk on that subject, which is incredible in itself that she got up and spoke in front of those people, but it's now been viewed 15 million times on YouTube. So, it's been incredibly popular and it's very, very inspiring. I would recommend you watch it. It's not very long. And the great thing about Susan Cain is that she's talking from her own experience. She's not saying, I am incredibly confident and this is how you do it. She's saying, do you know what, I've struggled with confidence a lot in my own life, and this is how you get through it, and this is how you recognise your strengths and use them to get value. And for me, this kind of took me back to the lessons I'd learned from Myers-Briggs near the beginning of my career, but I'd realised that I hadn't truly taken them on board. I'd still felt that introversion was something that I had to cope with and that I had to sort of fight against, and that I had to sort of pretend to be an extrovert, rather than saying, these are my strengths and this is how I can use them. So it sort of hammered the point home a lot better, really brought it to life for me. So I want to give an example of how all of this has been useful for me. And I'm going to talk about last Wednesday, Trump Day. And I'm not going to get political here, but safe to say that at The Guardian, Trump Day was a fairly gloomy day. There were a lot of calories consumed. I think we ate a lot of cake. But, sadly we couldn't just sit at our desks and eat cake. We had to galvanise ourselves. Not just the journalists, who obviously had to produce an awful lot of content, but the marketing teams as well. We were seeing massive amounts of traffic. We saw more traffic than we'd seen ever, even Brexit, by a large margin. And we're not just talking numbers here, we're talking very, very emotionally engaged people coming to The Guardian, some for the first time. So it was a massive opportunity for us, not just in terms of acquisition over that week, but also for learning. How can we best respond to moments like this in the future, and how can we convert it to acquisition? So I had to think about how I could best help. On my train on the way in, I was thinking out, how can I help? So first of all, I sort of checked all my team were all right, had enough donuts, that sort of thing. And then I grabbed my laptop and I went and sat with the team who are doing the kind of marketing testing. And I literally sat myself down at the right hand of the woman who was in charge. And every time there was a decision to be made, every time they were trying to work out, okay, which test should we run, which message should we run with, which region should we run this in, which content should we run this against, and then when should we turn this off, the team would turn and look at me and go, Celia, what should we do? And voice in my head wanted to say, I don't know. Why would I know? Why would I know more than you? But calmly, I would look at the data and I would take that into account with my own experience and probably a large amount of gut feel, and I would tell them. And what I had done is I had known my strengths and how to use them, how to apply them. I built up those relationships already so that they knew me and they trusted me so that I could go in and do that. And I literally went to go and sit at the table. And that, to me, added up to confidence. So, just to recap the things I've talked about, I hope some of this has been familiar to you. I hope you found some of it useful. I hope you've taken some tips that you can use in your own careers in data. And I just want to leave you with one final quote from Susan Cain, which is that everyone shines given the right lighting. Thank you.
Thank you for such a personal account of your career and the stories that you've been through, and for the book recommendation. So my copy arrives tomorrow. So thank you. So in terms of a question for you, you've clearly been on an incredible journey over the last few years. You've spent a lot of time thinking about confidence and where you need to develop. Are there any areas where it still remains a piece where you can be more confident, and when you look around you see that there's a few folks that are much stronger at you in a certain place?
Sure, good question. I think it's always a journey, and I think there's always something else to learn. For me, strangely, for an introvert, the area I feel less confident in is writing. So I would actually probably rather speak to a room of 100 people than to write a one-pager. I hate it. But working with journalists, you need to be able to do that, because sometimes they can only take in information if it's written like an article. Not even a picture or a chart will do. So that's one area where I kind of still learning and developing. Another one is I like prepared things. Again, I think that's an introvert thing. I hate being put on the spot, just like this. I think one of the scariest sentences you can hear is, let's go around the table and say something interesting about ourselves. I mean, does anyone really like that? Does anyone think, yay? So my advice for that is always have something prepared. I've got the same one that I say every single time for the last 10 years. And if you don't have anything interesting that you want to share with people, then just make one up, because no one's going to know.
I'll take that on board. Does anyone have any questions for Celia?
Well, I really liked your talk. It's
Thank
very
you.
close to the chest for me. I'm an extreme introvert, and even this is scary.
Well done.
So few months ago, I started managing a person. It's my first managing role, and that person's an extreme extrovert. And I feel that I'm failing, and I just would like your advice, maybe.
Do you know what? That's meant to be the best combination. I've heard a few times it said that it's better for introverts to manage extroverts and vice versa, and I'll tell you why. If you have an extrovert managing an extrovert, it's quite challenging. They're sort of fighting to get their opinion in. And if you have an introvert managing an introvert, it's also quite challenging, because they sort of never talk to each other and never get anything done. But that really is a great combination, and I've managed a fair number of extroverts over my time as well. And the great thing about that is you really you give them space. They have, their own space to do what they want, and they can come to you when they want to, but you kind of let them grow. And then the other way around is, if you're an extrovert managing introverts, you really help them come out of their shell. So it's a good combination. I'm sure you're doing a much better job than you think you are.
I hope so, but thank you. I'll give them more space then.
Any other questions in the room? I think we've got time for one more.
How do you... so The Guardian is obviously a paper with a political viewpoint, and you manage a lot of the data that influences how they serve their content, presumably, and the people around you as well. So how does The Guardian, or how do you think about data and about bias and about making sure that what you're sharing and influencing people to do is the right thing?
Sure. Okay. So there's a lot in there, and I think it's safe to say that data influences decisions to a varying amount in different bits of the business. So my team provides data and insight to 3 areas. The marketing, the kind of consumer marketing bit that I've already talked about, commercial, which is the ad revenue side, and editorial. And editorial are pretty much self-serve. They have a lot of the data surface that they can kind of access. They can see which articles are doing well on any particular day. So we're a bit more light touch with them. We do some deeper analysis into something like, Trump. And they have become a lot more data-driven, but I think it would be unrealistic to say that data is the only thing that they make their decisions on. And, there is always an editorial imperative about what they are going to write about. So The Guardian is fairly well known for writing lots of articles on a particular subject. We probably produce more articles per subject than some of the other papers. And yes, there is a long tail. Some of them don't get read as much, but I think there is that imperative of saying, well, actually, we want to provide these multiple viewpoints on this subject. Therefore, the data is not going to be the only thing we make our decision on. When it comes to making money, on the other hand, that's where you really have to listen to the numbers.
Great. I think we're done for questions on this timing. We're running pretty close. So we're going to finish up the session here. And over in the Cambridge suite next is going to be Sarah Hodgkins. She is the career coach that's here today. So if that is your session, if we can then ask you to move into the bar area whilst we wait for the Cambridge room to finish. And in here, we will be having Emma Kosh speaking about visualization.